Welcome, everyone. It's really great that we have such a large group of people joining us today. It's exciting to, I guess for me, for everyone to recognize that, like, quite frankly, I'm not sure there is a more relevant, important, or compelling subject for us to be talking about right now at this point in our history, in the country and the world. And it's just such a pleasure for me to be able to work with the great group that we have today, who will be presenting and speaking and answering your questions. So Canada's future in the global green economy couldn't be more relevant. And so what I'm going to do first of all is, well, I should introduce myself. I'm Bruce Laurie. I'm president of the Ivy Foundation and have close and fairly long relationships with many of the people on our call today that will be presenting, as well as the groups that will be describing this great report done by the Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions, Smart Prosperity Institute, and the Transition Accelerator. And before we get into the program, I would just like to begin by acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of all the lands that we are on today. And while we meet virtually, I wish to acknowledge the importance of the land that we all call home. And we do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in improving relationships between nations and to improving our own understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their cultures. We acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people that call this land home. So please join me in a moment of reflection to acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past and to consider how we can each move forward in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. So, on to our event. As I mentioned, it's co-hosted by the Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions, Smart Prosperity Institute, and the Transition Accelerator. And the discussion is going to focus on a new report called Canada's Future in a Net Zero World, Securing Our Place in the Global Green Economy. You can find a link to the report in the chat. And what we're going to do today is start off with a 30-minute presentation that will be delivered by Bentley, Allan, and Derek Eaton. And then we will follow this with an hour of discussion with our panelists. So I welcome you all to please submit questions. And we've got one of my favorite features in panels is the ability to upvote questions in the Q&A box. So please take advantage of that. And then finally, a note that this event is being recorded and will be available after the program on Sustainable Prosperity Institute's YouTube channel. I'm just going to take a moment to introduce Bentley and Derek. I've had the pleasure of working with Bentley and Derek over the last couple of years and following what I think is just such great and relevant work for us. Bentley is a resident fellow at the Transition Accelerator and former associate director of PICS, the Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions, and Derek Eaton is director of public policy research and outreach at the Smart Prosperity Institute. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Bentley and Derek, and I know you've got a presentation to share with us.
Great, thank you so much, Bruce. So thank you all for being here, and thank you to Bruce for moderating, and our distinguished panelists for joining us. And Derek Eaton and I are here to present, but we'd like to thank the whole team that contributed to this report, including our co-authors, Jonas Goldman, Teslan Augustin, Anika Slam, Stuart LG, and James Meadowcroft. We also wouldn't be here today without the support of the communications teams at all three of the organizations, so a special shout out to them. And we've also benefited from funding from both the Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions and the Ivy Foundation, and we're very grateful for the support that makes this work possible. So we'd like to start out today by laying out the motivation for a more strategic approach to Canadian industrial transition. And our starting point is that the global energy transition is underway, and that Canada has to position itself in rapidly forming global value chains. Part of the reason why we have to position ourselves is because Canada is a small open economy that is dependent on exports. And our number one export, of course, is oil and gas. And we need to consider what's going to happen to our economy over the next 50 years as this share of our trade balance declines. In order to compensate for the decline in fossil fuel energy products, we'd have to increase exports in each of the next top 10 categories by 20%. And to do that, we have to do it while each of these industries, and we're talking about the automotive sector, mining, forestry, agriculture, manufacturing, the chemical industry, the aerospace industry, all of Canada's major industries have to be increased in their global market share to compensate for this. And we have to do so, and we also have to develop new energy products like hydrogen and more clean power to export. We have to do this while each of these industries are undergoing global transformation and under intense global competition. So if we're going to do this, we have to start now. We can't let the long time horizons of this energy transition lull us into complacency in the same way that we let the long time horizons of the environmental crisis lull us into complacency. We're now paying the price in forest fires and flooding and other negative effects on our weather and climate systems because we waited too long to act on the environmental side. We can't wait too long to act on the economic side as well. And part of the motivation here is that though the federal government and some provinces here in Canada have taken significant actions to accelerate the transition, our trading partners and competitors are using green industrial strategies to position their economies in the value chains of the net zero world. Now, it's worth pausing for a second here to just define green industrial strategy, which is an intentional effort to build green industry through innovation and technological change. And it can include any variety of supply push and demand pull policies. The key is to align those policies so they provide a way to build, create, and improve the industries and the supply chains that we have. And industrial strategy is distinct from mitigation because the goal of green industrial strategy is to seize economic opportunity and to develop the economy. But industrial strategy is still a powerful tool for mitigation because it drives the cost reductions and builds the political coalitions that we need to ease the politics of the transition and drive sustainable decarbonization over multiple decades. Now, as we've said, Canada has made important investments in clean competitiveness and industrial transition, but those investments are often spread thin across all of the sectors and regions in the country. And we often see that priorities are fragmented across federal departments, federal and provincial governments and First Nations, and private actors, finance, industry associations, et cetera. And investments by the government are often one-off grants to individual firms. Instead, we need to provide focus on the top economic opportunities. And we could use roadmaps to align the provinces with the federal government and the private sector and catalyze actions. And we need these roadmaps to be the basis of a long-term strategy that really integrates all the policy tools that we're using and that really tries to place and strategically position Canada in the global economy of 2050. And finally, we need an approach that engages clusters or verticals or supply chains up and down from the upstream to the downstream. So what our report does to try to meet this challenge is lay out a 4-part framework for strategic action. And we're going to use this 4-part framework to structure the rest of the talk today. In the first part, we argue that we need to establish a vision of Canada's place in the world. Secondly, we need to identify top opportunities and build a balanced portfolio of priority investments. Third, we need to develop sectoral roadmaps that outline how to achieve industrial development and transition. And finally, we need to collaborate across traditional political and societal lines in order to advance the strategies. I'll hand it over to Derek to get us started with part 1.
Thanks, Bentley. So yes, part 1 is the vision for Canada's future in a decarbonizing world. We think this vision should be informed by the perspective of a small, open economy. Small means that Canada cannot directly compete with larger countries that have more capital and capacity to better exploit the larger economies of scale. Open means that we're dependent on exports and that lower cost competitors can and will enter our domestic markets. And there's also a need to ensure competitiveness in serving certain domestic markets to support our overall economic competitiveness. So think of buildings, construction, and the necessary materials such as cement and steel, which we're not necessarily exporting, but which affect our overall cost base. So the challenge motivating our work is that Canada needs to build industries that will position it in the 21st century global economy, the global green economy. And so as a small open economy, Canada should not try to replicate all parts of the value chain. Rather, we should be building or seeking to build competitive niches in high value added areas where we have greater chances of being relatively protected from intense global competition. So with this vision clear in our minds, the second step in our 4-part framework is to identify the specific technology areas that offer the greatest economic opportunities for Canada and which should be therefore priorities for building a balanced portfolio of investment areas. Now, we're trying to build on the efforts of others. This includes our own, I should say, Transition Pathways report. I contributed to that myself last year, and so did some of our other colleagues, co-authors. Also includes work by the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices, their report on Canada's net zero future last year, as well as there's a report on Sink or Swim, which addresses some of the same questions as our report. So, but what I'd like to emphasize is that we are going beyond which technologies will figure in Canada's decarbonization pathway, and we're trying to identify which technologies and associated goods and services offer the best opportunities for clean growth trajectories, including export opportunities. So for this analysis, we looked specifically at 5 main factors. First was assessing the role of the technology in a net zero future. For example, is the technology considered a safe bet or a wild card, to use CICC's terminology? What is the abatement potential? Second, we looked at the readiness level of the technology. How close to deployment is it? How much more R&D is required? This helps us understand the types of challenges there are in building an advantage in production. Third, we assessed the resources or inputs needed in terms of raw materials, research, expertise, for Canada to become a global leader in a particular industry or technology, and understanding how and if there are any upstream linkages with existing industries. Are there factors such as supply restrictions, or resource wealth, or human capital that would give Canada a long-term structural advantage? And relatedly, we examined what kind of competitive advantage in innovation Canada has. So based on our current expertise, our IP, our entrepreneurship in this space. And finally, we looked at downstream, at factors influencing the market potential of a particular technology. What's the likely export potential? Where, in terms of creating market demand, could procurement policies play a role? But we didn't just do this analysis ourselves. We also conducted a consensus survey of top experts, policymakers, investors, entrepreneurs. This type of survey is referred to in the academic literature as a CHIPS study, because in it we ask participants to allocate resources, or chips, if you will, across opportunity areas. And to give you a flavor of what that looked like, we'd actually like to conduct a simplified version with everyone online right now through a poll. We would like you to offer your perspective on which opportunities offer the most potential for the Canadian economy and a global economy moving towards net zero. You can scan this QR code or visit slido.com. There's information in the chat. If you go to slido.com, you enter the hashtag net zero, and you'll be brought to the poll. So while you have a look at that, I'll just like to highlight that while today we're just doing this chip allocation with all of you, we did much more than that with the people our respondents in our survey. So with each one of them, we followed up with a discussion to understand the reasoning behind their choices, to generate further insights into factors affecting the likelihood of success of particular opportunities. Importantly, trying to identify key or major uncertainties that affect these prospects. So we'll review the results of the poll after the presentation, but now I'd like to move on so we can summarize the top opportunities as identified in the report. And I should emphasize that our initial results identified 2 tiers of opportunities. We're just showing the first tier here. The second tier might also offer opportunities, but don't figure in our top list, but that you'll find those in the report.
So the first opportunity that we identified is manufacturing medium and heavy duty zero emissions vehicles. Canada has world-leading firms in electric and fuel cell school buses, municipal vehicles, forklifts, and other important vehicle niches, as well as upstream capacity in mining and battery metals. And there's a real opportunity for us to bring this industry to scale and build innovation clusters around it so that we can develop a large export share in this important vehicle market. Now, I just want to note that we separated medium and heavy duty from the light duty or the passenger vehicle market. And this isn't to say that that's not an important market. Absolutely, Canada must convert its existing light duty automotive sector and its 500,000 jobs to electric vehicles manufacturing. And the government is seized of that. But we thought that highlighting medium and heavy duty vehicles was an important opportunity because it helps us to build up this homegrown sector where the automotive OEMs in the light duty sector are mostly foreign owned. Here we actually have some Canadian owned firms. We could really build homegrown capacity and homegrown Canadian manufacturing jobs that is potentially globally competitive, and that opens up a new export avenue.
So the second opportunity is hydrogen. I don't think that that's going to be a surprise to many people. Canada, of course, is a world leader in low carbon blue hydrogen, based on carbon capture, utilization, and storage as well. We have unmatched research capacity in fuel cell technology, but we have to take advantage of these opportunities. There really is only a short window for exports before cheap renewables and electrolyzers give production in other countries an advantage.
The third is green chemistry, which is one of my personal favorites on the list. It really highlights the need to create upstream capacity in a science-intensive basis that'll be useful across the energy transition. But we particularly were interested in supporting downstream markets in biofuels, especially sustainable aviation fuels, as well as plastics, sustainable chemicals, fertilizers, and battery metals. But green chemistry is one of these structurally important pieces of a net zero economy that we have to make real upstream investments in right now if we're going to compete long term over an energy intensive energy transition.
So the fourth one is mass timber, which can add value to the forestry industry in Canada while displacing carbon intensive materials such as cement and steel. The opportunities in manufactured wood are an immediate priority, but there's also an opportunity to develop prefabrication industry for modular building design. Clearly we have a strong forestry industry, plenty of trees, but these downstream opportunities are beckoning. Just last week or the week before, for example, there was an announcement, the city of Amsterdam's building a new residential neighborhood with a few thousand new homes, and there's a minimum requirement for the use of mass timber or structural wood in the construction. Those trees don't grow in the Netherlands, and they're probably not going to be coming from Russia in the near future.
The fifth is carbon capture, utilization, and storage. Canada has expertise in CCUS deployment with hydrogen production. It has emerging firms that are really leading the charge on new utilization technologies. And it has a nascent and really almost world-leading direct air capture industry. Each of these opportunities is ready to scale up, but policies and investments are needed to bring the downstream markets necessary to provide demand pull online.
So next is green aluminum. Green steel, cement, and aluminum are all critical considerations in making our energy transition. They're all heavy emitters, they're tied to good jobs and strategic industries. But our analysis has looked at green steel and cement and concluded that while they're essential to Canada's decarbonization goals, there's probably relatively limited opportunity for Canada to generate exports or become a world-leading industry in those areas. That doesn't mean we don't need to decarbonize them, but Canada does have the potential to lead in the low-carbon aluminum supply chain, particularly with a focus on smelting. And then the last or the seventh area in this first tier list is alternative proteins. Canada clearly has an opportunity to make alternative proteins a focal point of an agricultural processing and manufacturing industry. Canada is already, of course, a world leader in the production of lentils and peas, among other relevant crops, but we should seek to move down the value chain And bringing an industry like alternative proteins up to scale would provide a real pull for agricultural decarbonization techniques. Again, there's some initial efforts with the protein supercluster, but we have a much bigger opportunity to seize here. So in this report, we also point to a number of supporting structural conditions for these opportunities. These include one, a clean and integrated grid, two, a supply of net zero minerals, and three, transparent and verifiable carbon accounting. What we really like about this list, or what we find compelling about it, is that it builds on Canada's economic strengths in a range of industries, in automotive manufacturing and parts, in agriculture, in heavy industry, in forestry, in chemicals, in fuels. And it all while they illustrate how we might add manufacturing value add to our important natural resource sectors. If we successfully develop world-leading industries in these areas, we will generate the exports needed to stave off a looming economic crisis. But this list could be wrong. And while we will admit that, with the amount of, we've been working on this for about a year, and a few other people have started as well, we're trying to make the point that we desperately need a national conversation about these priorities and strategies. So moving on to the third part of our strategic framework, that's roadmaps. Federal, provincial, and First Nations governments can work with various actors, experts, private sector, civil society, to co-develop roadmaps that will lay out targets, sequences, policies, investments, to bring these opportunities, investments to scale. And in fact, the #1 recommendation of Canada's expert panel on sustainable finance 3 years ago, co-led by Andy Chisholm, who's very fortunate to have him as one of our panelists today. The #1 recommendation of that panel was to map out Canada's long-term path to a low emissions, climate smart economy, sector by sector, with associated capital plans. Now, there's some initial efforts in this direction, for example, in the cement sector and a few others, but not nearly enough. The clock is ticking. A second major issue around roadmaps is where to target, around industrial strategy is where to target it. Do we talk about the sector, the subsector, at what level? We propose to focus industrial strategy on clusters. For example, Canada has a world-leading industry in medium and heavy-duty vehicles. Bentley's just described that, which could be considered the core technology here in this slide. Now, the government has made important investments, particularly at the core level, which is good. But we need to look upstream. And once we do that, we see that the success of the medium and heavy-duty vehicles industry depends on mining and materials clusters, and also the innovative capacities of an advanced manufacturing cluster, for example, batteries. And importantly, the success of the core technology, the medium and heavy-duty vehicle manufacturing, also depends on developing the various end-use markets through procurement, regulation, mandates, pricing support. So a key principle of industrial strategy, of modern industrial strategy, is really alignment throughout the value chain. And that's why road mapping is important. So working back from say a 2050 vision, a well-facilitated road mapping exercise can clarify priority targets and organize a cluster into streams of action with clear sequences. Then you can overlay the policies and investments needed to achieve these targets. This would provide a strong pipeline of projects for the Net Zero Accelerator and other funds, but also inspire confidence and instill a sense of purpose in a range of stakeholders, industry players, the public, all of whom need to participate fully in the processes of collective discovery underlying the energy transition. So road mapping is the third component of the strategic framework, and we could say more about the how of this. There's some in the report, but I'll turn it over to Bentley now for the fourth component.
So to build effective roadmaps and to deliver on those roadmaps, we need to collaborate. We need institutions and processes that will support creative, experimental, and focused interactions between the government, industry, Indigenous communities, labor unions, and other elements of civil society. To get this right, we need to learn from international best practices and the latest research. And we've been doing a lot of work in this area, and our work highlights three essential roles for the government. The first is that governments have to provide strategic focus, the strategic focus necessary to set priorities and then to set really clear targets that'll actually motivate some work inside these sectors. Well, and only the government represents the intergenerational interests of all Canadians. And so it has a special responsibility to articulate the public purpose that we're trying to achieve here and to catalyze action. Second, the government needs to use public finance to facilitate experimentation and learning. This is a long transition, it's innovation intensive, and we need to have an adaptive policy process that can move forward and to advance the technologies and the supply chains that we need. And one way in which we could do this right now is that the government could shift its focus from providing demonstration funds to foreign firms that are already commercial the government should shift from providing subsidies to commercial stage projects by foreign firms to providing demonstration funds to Canadian firms. And third, the government has an important role in ensuring that supply chains are coordinated, supported, and aligned. And this means working with public-private partnerships to collaborate on industry roadmaps like the ones that we're proposing, to connect firms together and get them talking and collaborating, to pool finance, and to catalyze action. And the government really shouldn't and cannot do an industrial strategy by itself. In fact, the literature is very clear that the foundation of a good industrial strategy is strong communication between the government and all the other aspects of society. So we need channels of communication and collaboration. How can we do that? One key model would be to build public-private partnerships that can play an important role. These might be bridging organizations, they might be big demonstration funds with deep domain expertise. There's lots of different ways to do the institutional design. One example that we could draw on in the Canadian context is AOSRA, which in Alberta helped to build the oil sands. It's a case where a Crown corporation partnered with industry and academia to drive the research, development, and deployment necessary to bring new technologies online and to make the techno-economics of the oil sands work. It provided an avenue for all these different sectors of society in Alberta to work together. And so Canada really has its own experience with industrial strategy. We're just not used to calling it that, and we're just not used to recognizing it for what it was. So we can draw on these Canadian experiences. There's also lots more at the federal level and throughout history, but we can also look to international case studies. Another instructive example for Canada is the EU battery and hydrogen strategy. If you think about it, this is kind of an analogous situation. The European Commission is kind of like a weak central government in a political community that has lots of overlapping jurisdictions and a variety of political entities, industries, labor unions, and investment banks that need to be brought together into a coherent strategy. And that's kind of analogous to the same situation we have in a federal structure with lots of different indigenous communities and other agencies, and with their own interests and their own funds, right? Now, to manage this complexity, the EU relies on InnoEnergy, a public-private partnership to engage with stakeholders, do supply chain analysis, and serve as an accelerator for companies that need to be spun up in order to fill the strategic holes that exist in the supply chains.
So let me just sum up with key messages we want you to take away today. We need to focus strategic efforts in high priority areas. We need to build clusters with high value add to support prosperity through jobs and exports. We also need to establish and support these externally driven roadmap exercises for priority clusters. Government should be actively involved, as Bentley's just described, but the process could best be led by external actors to promote broad buy-in, nimbleness, and co-creation. We should use roadmaps to set priorities and strategically align investments and actions by private and public sectors, including both federal and provincial actors, ensuring they're all pulling together. A portion of existing funds, such as the Net Zero Accelerator Fund, that could be allocated for roadmaps or related strategic experimentation. Finally, there's a need to build these intermediaries and the broader community of independent expertise in Canada to support smart, green industrial strategy, both within and outside the government. So that's all we wanted to share in terms of the report findings. We very much appreciate everybody's participation today and our chance to share this work with you. We're looking forward to discussing this with the panelists and the online participants and to seeing the Slido poll results. So back to you, Bruce.
Great, thank you so much, Bentley and Derek. And I've, as one of you mentioned earlier, I've seen this presentation a few times, and every time I still listen to it with riveted attention, because I think it's just so clearly clearly presented, and although some of it seems intuitive, it feels like we're really not doing a lot of what you're suggesting that we do. So thank you for that. As a reminder, I want to encourage the audience to share questions in the Q&A, and that you can upvote those questions. And I've seen, I've been watching and seeing a few questions come in there, so thanks for that. What we're going to, before we get started, is we're going to look at the poll results. And Marion, you're bringing those up. Thank you. So, timber alternative proteins. Oh, Bentley and Derek, do you want to give us some top of mind thoughts on our group's ranking of the 7 priority sectors? Sounds like you guys might have influenced the results a little bit.
Yeah, I think actually this looks like we canned the results, because I think it almost maps exactly onto the ranking that we gave them. And importantly, the ranking that we gave them was almost just nominal, in the sense that you're going to have to kind of go in sequence, really, because it would be difficult to say you could do all these at the same time. But this is great to have these results and to have this reinforcement of our intuition.
Indeed, I'm just scanning the results from the actual numerical results we had from our respondents, and not even seeing there a lot of difference, perhaps. We said a key principle is alignment, so maybe we're off to a good start here.
Yeah,
absolutely. Got some consensus nationally already.
Excellent, great, thank you so much. So of course, sorry about that. Full screen. Great. It's my pleasure now to introduce our panelists for the discussion. And I've actually had the great pleasure of working closely with all 4 of you on different projects over the last number of years. So this is a super fun event for me. First off, we are going to hear from Andy Chisholm, and Andy's a board member of RBC and Mars, and as Derek mentioned, was a member of the expert panel on sustainable finance. And just a reminder, so each of our panelists are going to speak for 3 minutes, and then we're going to have a good amount of time at the end to have some questions and answers. So Andy.
Great, thanks, Bruce. Good to see you. Good to be here. I think the report is tremendous in trying to move further along the curve towards action. It's very much directionally consistent with what was put forward 3 years ago now by the expert panel. It's just a pity that it is 3 years. The 3 years from 2019 to 2030, where we've got to be essentially halfway to our target, those are really valuable years. And the fact we're still talking about the same stuff, I think, underlines the urgency that the next 3 years are really geared towards action. And the good news is this report is talking about action. The points I'd like to emphasize and that resonate very much with me, starting with that point, it's important to act, not just to wait and see. Others are acting internationally, as was discussed. It's not going to be perfect, but we have enough reports. We have enough ideas. We can act in a thoughtful, collaborative, coordinated manner relevant to the circumstances in Canada, and it won't be perfect, but it will ensure that we get to a positive outcome. And to galvanize action, this absolutely requires vision. And again, that vision has got to be directional. It's not going to be perfect. I'm pleased that this report focuses on the notion of opportunity as much as risk, and that it talks about a real articulation of sustainable roadmaps, because I think there's a really poor understanding of what does transition mean. There's a bias in interpretation towards cost as opposed to opportunity, and not enough stakeholders really understand what does transition mean, what can it mean. And part of what it'll mean, indeed, is that there's some prioritization, there's some concentration of activity, and that there is a glide path from the old to the new. Hopefully we can accelerate that glide path, but there is a glide path. If it's too abrupt, we crash. If it's too shallow, we don't reach our target. And we need to articulate that kind of vision and that notion of transition. But it's got to be ambitious, for sure. Obviously, meeting or exceeding our Paris-aligned goals has got to be front and center. But we've got to be in a better place environmentally and socially, but also economically. For it to result in broad market support, it needs to have positive economic outcomes. And to have positive long-term economic outcomes, we got to focus on building competitiveness and build that into our plans and our actions and our mindsets. And ultimately, the role of the private sector has got to be front and center, and it's got to be in a proactive, not a reactive kind of manner. And it's got to be the most senior minds focused on this, not just industry associations broadly, but the most senior minds with CEOs very, very engaged in working through what is the art of the possible and collaborating within their industry in that respect. And then working with all levels of government to ensure that the policies are aligned and that the private sector can get done what it needs to do with economic outcomes that work, building competitiveness as is articulated in this report. And finally, it's going to take an enormous amount of outreach and activity on the part of the private sector, not just on the part of the government, with stakeholders to build support around these kind of activities and to genuinely inform their plans and bring those ideas and input into their plans from the broad stakeholder community.
Great, thanks so much, Andy. We're going to run right through our panel here and have questions at the end. Next, Janet Ansley is Chief Sustainability Officer for Cuevas Energy and active in a bunch of other things as well. So thanks for joining us, Janet.
Thanks, a pleasure to be here. Cuevas Energy is an energy transition company. So a lot of your report really resonated with me and what the challenges are for business. An energy transition company means we produce natural gas. We do that, in the conventional manner, but we are looking to take that natural gas and in some cases use it to produce power and potentially transform it into hydrogen, produce power from that, or produce power in some way using carbon capture and storage. But we're also in the renewable energy business because we see the two going hand in hand in a market like Alberta, where we can have renewables, but we also need a firm grid support to those renewables when the sun isn't shining and the wind isn't blowing. But we do see the need to decarbonize that natural gas in order to achieve our Paris goals over the longer term. And the challenges that you describe in the report are front and center, as we look at our business plan and how we're going to execute on it. We've got about 1.8 gigawatts of power projects in our inventory, and looking for the market signals where we can get paid, either that the low carbon power is required, or we can get paid a premium for the low carbon power, which means our customers need to have the similar certainty as to why they would be buying that low carbon power. and to create the demand. The report also made the point about when you're looking at these major projects, billions of dollars worth of capital, that especially where you're looking at either tweaking proven technology, improving on proven technology and deploying it, that you need the right kind of incentives. So not only do you need the market signal, and some of that has to do with policy, but you need, sometimes incentive from government to, as I think as the report said, to deploy pilot projects and those types of things. And those incentives often are spread too thin. It's sort of trying to line up the holes in a bunch of Swiss cheese to get just to the right point when you're thinking about large capital projects. And that's why many projects fail. They just cannot get the signal from different levels of government in order to create the right conditions for a positive investment decision. And we also, of course, have to compete. Andy raised competitiveness, and other markets are moving ahead quite quickly on some of these. The United States has declared that they would like to get carbon capture and storage and utilization, if that's possible, down to about $100 a ton by 2030, and they are incentivizing their massive industry correctly in order to achieve that goal, just through sheer scale of deployment. And Andy also talked about access to capital. Finally, you can't move ahead with any of these plans unless you can finance them. I think Andy said you need positive long-term economic outcomes. In other words, if you're a business, you have to have a good opportunity to make money, potentially over a 30 or 40-year period, so you can pay back the cost of your project and deliver a return to your shareholders. So eliminating the risk or reducing the risk so that capital can be provided on a lower cost basis. There's a lot to do with policy in there to create, again, the clear market signals. But there's also, I think, a realization that we have to kind of just get out of the starting gates here. Every day that we are putting more carbon dioxide, more methane into the atmosphere means that we just have to do more in the future. So we really have to just start thinking now about how we're going to get out of the starting block, and how Canada's industry is going to be able to do that, to come alongside all of our stakeholders so that we can meet these goals. And I think you started the report out correctly about the real cost to the economy potentially. And just a final quick point is that this isn't just about energy as an export. This is also about energy as an enabler of all the other industries, particularly low carbon, affordable energy as an enabler of all the other industries in Canada. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Janet. Now we're going to move on to Mo Cabrera, and Mo is a senior consultant at Dunsky Energy and a senior strategic advisor at Accelerate, which is an electric vehicle supply chain group and co-chair of the Canadian Battery Task Force. So Mo, I know we rely on you whenever we have questions about the electric vehicle sector, so a pleasure to have you.
Thanks, Bruce. Really appreciate it, and pleasure to be here with everyone. It's been great seeing this report and seeing the presentation. I think it really does a great job at linking the climate action that's needed with the economic implications that we're gonna have to really think about. We simply cannot secure the widespread support, whether political, social, the buy-in that we need, if we're not able to really make a clear case for Canada's future economy and the green transition. So I think there's no doubt that Canada can, seize those opportunities that are associated with the clean energy transition under the right strategic and framework, right? And it's clear that we need to pivot from, an oil and gas, from being an oil and gas powerhouse to a clean powerhouse. And, this won't just happen without really a very clear plan in terms of understanding the pathway and the milestones that we need to hit along the way. And I think, the framework that was proposed here in the report really follows international best practices. What we've seen has worked in the past in terms of industrial strategy, and really provides those clear next steps that need to be taken and that could leverage that public-private partnership. So on my end, I've been involved on some of the initial conversations that are happening on that road mapping exercise when it comes to zero emission vehicle manufacturing. And specifically in this area, you know, this is something that I think rightly was identified as a key opportunity for Canada. And I think just to give a bit of context, you know, the Canadian auto sector is one of the largest manufacturing sectors. You know, vehicles are our second most exported product. You know, but it's been on the decline for the past 20 years. You know, we went from being number 5 in 1999 to around number 13, 14, you know, today. So, but the level of disruption that this sector is seeing, I think, you know, it's the biggest we've seen since the invention of the internal combustion engine. And Canada has a real opportunity to capitalize on this disruption, to leverage its strategic advantages in this emerging zero emission vehicle supply chain. So not only to stop the losses that we've seen over the last 2 decades, but maybe to even reverse this downward trend. And to do that, I think we got to think of the automotive more than just light duty vehicles. You know, we've got to think of the battery components that are emerging in the upstream side, but also we've got to think of the trucks and buses and the different transportation electrification technologies that are emerging even on the fuel cell side for heavy duty and heavy machinery and off-road vehicles. So I think, you know, there's a lot of different components to the supply chain that need to be considered, and also it needs to be understood which segments are going to enable others and which segments are going to be critical for charting the pathway towards our objectives and how much value we can capture and what are the most value added components. So happy to talk more about some of those details, but I think overall, you know, the framework here that's been presented is extremely valuable to see. And I think it really helps chart a pathway in terms of how do we actually capture these opportunities, as opposed to just continue to talk about the potential, but not really implementing actions that can help us, you know, materialize those opportunities. Great,
thanks so much, Mo. And last, but of course not least, Sandra Odell. Sandra's VP and Global Head of Sustainability at Scotiabank. And Sandra, what do you have to say for us on all of this?
Okay, thanks very much. Well, I very much support the comments made by the other panelists, and also thank you very much for a great presentation by the presenters. I was really pleased to see 3 things really resonate strongly in the report, which I read last night, and of course the presentation on it we just got. And 3 things that resonated the most were, of course, number 1, the principle of prioritizing versus spreading resources too thin. Number 2, taking a systems approach. And then number 3, of course, you know, whatever pathways we choose on a sector basis have to consider long-term economic costs and benefits, or else really they won't happen. And the reason those things stood out in particular is because at Scotiabank, we actually just recently completed the first phase of our own net zero pathways work. So we've been carefully looking at the bank's role in a net zero world, well, for a while, but with a specific focus project over the past almost 12 months. Looking into where emissions come from in our financing, what is our role as a bank in helping to support the decarbonization of the economy, et cetera. So actually on Tuesday, we launched our inaugural Net Zero Pathways report. So if you're interested, you can find it on scotiabank.com, responsibility and impact. So in that, we look at, you know, what is it that we should be doing in our operations, in our climate-related financing, in our looking at the way that we work collaboratively with our customers. What is our financed emission profile? How do we prioritize the sectors that we should be focused on in decarbonization, as well as in opportunity seeking? And sometimes, many times those go together. And then last but not least, what kinds of partnerships and community related supports, whether it's research, whether it's, you know, looking at economic resilience and social issues associated with a change in the economy, where should we be placing our resources on that front? So in looking at that, in that work, and again, thinking about pieces that resonated in the report about Canada's position in a net zero world, and as we're thinking about the role of banks and the finance sector in a net zero world, I think, if I had to pick three things that really jumped out for us and that we sort of knew, but we confirmed with a lot of data and a year's worth of work with a deep dive with different experts and consultants and clients, I'd say there's really three things that come out of this. So number one, not a surprise to anyone on this call, but meeting net zero by 2050 is going to be really, really, really hard in Canada and globally, and primarily, and I think Janet talked about this and others have as well, but primarily we have a lot of work to do in making zero emission sources of energy available to everyone at a reasonable price and really quickly. And that is a complete system overhaul because anyway, I'm sure we'll get into it in the discussion, and obviously some of it was covered in the report, but this is a massive transformation of systems in Canada, obviously, but also globally that we obviously started too late on. So we can't underestimate how hard this is going to be. I think for the financial sector, the other second takeaway that I want to flag is that, we recognize, and we, did a lot of work to look into this carefully, our ability to meet net zero targets in financing and in our own, upstream, downstream emissions depends entirely on what happens in the communities and in the economies in which we operate. And so we're highly motivated to collaborate across the public and private sectors, across the not-for-profit sectors, because we really see that this is the only way that we're going to collectively get this job done. And then I think thirdly, the other thing that we've said it before, and certainly a lot of focus on the role of finance and how the sustainable finance is going to help move the needle on things. I think one of the things that is important for everybody to think about, including us in the bank, is that everything we finance has a carbon footprint. Absolutely everything. This is not a simple, simple case of moving capital flows, from this sector to that sector, because every sector has emissions, and the removing bank financing from one sector doesn't change the supply, the demand for goods and services. So we have to be very thoughtful about how all of the different pieces of this ecosystem of actors interact in order to create the optimal outcome for the environment, but also, as the report talks about, for our long-term economic prospects and of course for our social fabric. So lots of learnings that resonate from the report, and certainly lots that's applicable in finance as well. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much, Sandra, and great to see your net zero report come out. So on to the questions, and thank you for those who follow the instructions. There are a lot of questions in the Q&A, and I'm going to start with one that's kind of a combination of a few that are there, and I think some things that have come out of this conversation. And it seems to me that your report, Derek and Bentley, is a combination of the what, like what are the things that we need to be focusing on. But I guess what I take from it that's even perhaps more important is it's the how, like how do we actually go about aligning the investments, getting the finance in place, setting the priorities, being more strategic. And there's a question for you all basically around this idea that we need to innovate quickly and we need to get on with these investments, but that Canada does not have a great reputation for innovation, that we don't tend to move very quickly. There's a lot of kind of entrenched status quo interests that are making things a little more slow, that we don't have, as a reference to Peter Nicholson's great paper on this. So I'm just wondering if and I'm just going to open up the floor, maybe starting with Bentley and Derek and then everyone else, like this idea of Canada just not being well suited to moving quickly, to innovating, to being able to mobilize capital. Like how do we unstick that?
Yeah, I mean, that's great. I think that I'm fully, I think Andy's comment really that what we need to do is get started, get directional, and not be perfect. Like, let's just go ahead and start breaking eggs. That's basically my view. And that's what's great about demonstration funds. That's what's great about big public-private partnerships that are focused on experiments, right? Like, let's try these technologies out in a public way that allow all the firms to see it, that allow all the financiers to see it. This is one of the things that Germany does so well because it has a really strong local banking sector. The financiers are involved in their local industries. They know the plants that are in their neighborhood. And so one of the things we need to do is get finance to view these experiments, these technological experiments, get finance folks to understand the engineering a little bit, because that's what we're going to be doing here over the next 30 or 40 years. So we got to build up that shared expertise, that shared pool. And it's not going to be perfect. We have to be adaptive. We have to learn over time, and we have to develop and invest in our capacity for learning. And that means investing in small, nimble agencies and public-private partnerships that have deep domain expertise, that really understand this stuff, and that can continue to draw on this deep, rich vein of material that's coming out of these big public experiments, which will be wrong. We'll learn as we go, and we have to be ready to do that, and we can't be waiting. And I'll just say on the Canadian thing, I understand this attitude that Canadians are risk averse and not ready to do it. But Andy, the only thing I would say to you too is as a palliative to make things go a little bit better, that it's taken us so long to get back to the same point that we were at, is that, you know, from the time that we finished this report, which was basically in October, until the present, I've already been invited to work with a number of different industries and to get the work started, to start breaking those eggs. And what I see in those conversations is that industry is ready to go. They're ready to go. They want to do this, and they're not going to wait, and they're excited. And so it's really about creating those spaces where we can harness the energy that I see already out there, already bubbling at the surface, rather than waiting until we get the perfect plan together before we do anything.
Yeah, I know that's very well put, Bentley. I'm not sure, you know, in terms of what else to add to that. There's, you know, we think about, you know, sort of traditional approach to innovation in Canada, and there's been it's been criticized many times for not being a coordinated approach, not being strategic enough, and we can hear the criticisms. But I think if we look at examples of success, we've talked about Austria, and there was a great comment in the chat, you know, sort of putting some nuance on that. If we look at some areas around agriculture, where we do have strengths, I mean, the role of the research infrastructure of Genome Canada, for example, in supporting that, or in health research, where we see our strengths is where there is some elements of a strategic and coordinated approach that that can deliver. And so why we don't do that more? I think there's a number of factors, a number of explanations. You know, we had to look at our particular federal, provincial configuration and dynamics. But as we pointed out, I think Bentley mentioned it too earlier on, you know, other places like the European Community with 26, 27 member states and a sort of federal structure are able to solve some of these conundrums and political questions and identify strategic priorities on which they move at that scale. So.
Derek, Andy?
Well, I fully agree with the comments that were made, and it is difficult, but I'd start with the notion, let's not undersell ourselves on innovation. We actually know how to do innovation. We create a lot of innovative companies. We have a lot of bright people within business, within academia, other R&D at corporations and so on. We know how to do this stuff. And so it's a matter of acting in a coordinated manner, which includes policy alignment, incentives, disincentives, and it includes from the private sector, the business community, a real sense of responsibility. Shifting that notion of we must to I must. And when it becomes the I must, then you figure things out. And in that regard, the financial sector has got certainly a very big role to play. Like all other actors, it's a complicated role because it operates on a thoughtful, analytical, risk-adjusted basis, and it reports to a regulator. And the long-term stability of the economy is really critical. And it's got to act in a responsible manner that way. But the financial services sector, I think, can take two different mindsets. One is more reactive. Clients will do what they'll do and we'll support them. Or it can be more proactive. We're going to use our convening power. We're going to look to new market structures, new instruments. We're going to create new asset classes where it's required. We're going to emphasize the notion of blended finance techniques, where you utilize government finance together with market-based finance, and sometimes with a middle ground where concessionary finance all comes together to be able to create a risk-adjusted outcome that provides sufficient return for the market to act. But it takes a lot of proactivity to do that, and a switch has got to flip from can't do to can do if only we can put this in place, and then go figure out how to put that missing piece in place. Sometimes it'll be government-based, sometimes it'll be others, government to defray risk, government to enhance a return, government to shift a policy, government to create more predictability, but they need to know what to do in a very practical way. We can't wait for them because they won't be able to figure it out. Business has got to say, I will do this if you are able to do that.
Great, thank you so much, Andy. So I'm going to try to categorize first some questions that are coming in that are a little bit more high level, not specific to the technologies, but in all of these, a lot of people like to dig in on, why hydrogen versus, plant protein, et cetera. So, but on the high level stuff, there are a number of questions that are relating to kind of Canada's role in the world, right? So as you pointed out in the report and the presentation, Derek, we're kind of a relatively small country. We're playing within a global environment for a lot of these. And so there's a few points that came out in terms of Canada either, aligning with broader global initiatives. Do we need a global carbon tax, for example? How much can we basically do on our own? How much do we need to be collaborating? How much, are we doing it in a way that's competitive? And so just, touching on all of those things, essentially about the recognition that we're, a relatively small economy.
Sure, and that provides us with a challenge that, say, our neighbors to the south don't have to the same degree. As a small economy, we're highly dependent on exports, and we need to. One reason we need to act now, we were trying to stress, is that in a lot of these new value chains, there are the other countries are moving, other industries are moving, and these global value chains of the net zero economy are starting to form, and we're seeing a lot of that, of course, for example, in zero emission vehicles. That's happening without a global carbon price, right? We don't need to wait. We can't wait for for further international agreement. Yes, we'd all like to see even sort of a more coordinated and more ambitious agreements among the governments of the world. But of course, as the events of the last few weeks are showing us, we're actually entering into a new age of, or maybe some of us haven't been recognizing it, of geopolitical fractures and schisms. So that also has to inform our thinking about about Canada's role, the opportunities for Canada within that, within clearly a sort of European transatlantic global economy of the world. That we need to see that certainly as a core, and we need to be, this is also why we need to be strategic, because we can't own every podium across all these different events in the international, whatever the Transition Olympics. We need to be strategic there, and we need to be proactive, as Andy has just said.
I would also just say, though, that the same argument that Andy pointed out that gets circulated, like we're letting perfection be the enemy good at the domestic level. We can't let perfection be the enemy of the good at the global level either. We don't have to wait for a coherent global carbon tax or a Kyoto Protocol style, global cap and trade that's airtight in order for us to think that we can take advantage of our ESG advantages. In battery metals, for example, the Global Battery Alliance is putting together a passport system, which will create the traceability for the metals up and down the supply chain. And that's going to create a market for batteries that are produced with clean energy and with, minerals that are collected under good governance. And so we don't need to wait. That's going to happen, and we need to act on it. And also, I would say that we can go sector by sector globally, and I think this is what's going to happen. If we look carefully at the EU-US steel deal that was announced late last year, this is really a blueprint for, I think, how industrial strategy is going to unfold at the global level, where countries within that want to create kind of a block or a common market will come together, figure out what the life cycle analysis is for that sector, and start to erect a little bit of a carbon border adjustment or a little bit of a non-tariff barrier around that sector that will allow them to do strong sector deals domestically, but create a common market for goods. Canada's got to be out in front of these industries so that the LCA is partly being formed by the experiments that we're conducting, and that we're already inside the fence on these industries because we're producing the technologies, we're located in the value chains, and we're part of the conversation because we've made investments and we've realized that we're going to be strategically positioned in these sector by sector global deals that I think are going to start to be constructed over the next couple of years here.
Great, thanks, Bentley. And the next question might draw in some of our other panelists. And I'm going to try to, again, weave a few ideas here, and it's a combination of like what constitutes a subsidy. Are we subsidizing things that might actually not be accelerating that kind of glide path you talked about, Andy? And specifically what's come up a couple of times is the role of carbon capture and storage. So we know that carbon capture is a big part of basically all of the analyses going forward in terms of how we're going to net zero. I guess it's a question of how it's done, and a question that's come up, I think, in a few, and I guess it's a combination of the challenge of, breaking through kind of the, entrenched, not in a negative way, but, the status quo of energy production. And is carbon capture and storage investment from public money just another form of a subsidy to the oil and gas sector? So it's just a combination of those things. Like, how do we break through in industrial strategies that are helpful on the transition?
I would turn it over to Janet to maybe see if she has.
I was going to turn it over to Janet too, but I didn't want to put her on the spot. But Janet, I can see that you've unmuted, so go ahead.
Yeah, sure, glad to chat about that. In fact, as part of my work with the Public Policy Forum as a fellow there, we just finished a report called Accelerating Growth in Carbon Management that provides, as a result of a lot of stakeholder engagement, coalesces a lot of feedback into recommendations for government on how to advance carbon management, which includes carbon capture, storage, and use. Pardon my voice, I've got a bit of a cold. And it's a tough issue, the subsidies, but incentives, subsidies, whatever you call them. But the fact of the matter is, you're not going to get these projects moving ahead unless there is some support from government, and that isn't enough. You also need, on the other end, the markets, again, that are going to provide a premium or a requirement for those lower carbon products that come as a result. And then we also need the enabling legislation and all sorts of work done. It was mentioned about carbon accounting and verification. There needs to be the measurement, monitoring, and verification of what carbon actually gets stored. And these projects aren't cheap. You're talking about, again, through the infrastructure of the capture technology. And there's different prices of how much that costs depending on where you're capturing it from, the infrastructure to bring it to the sequestration location or an area where it can be used long term. Maybe it can be used in a circular kind of economy, and there can actually be a demand for carbon for things like, graphene or other things. But right now, the technology and the pots and the pans needs to have someone to pay for it. And right now, I think there's a huge issue because you've got a cycle. We just went through an extremely long, low price cycle in the oil and gas industry, which took a lot of capital out of the system. And now we're into a very sharp, high price cycle. And I think there needs to be some real questions about to what degree should we be supporting this technology, but knowing that over the long term, this is going to be technology used by many different industries. It is now cement, power, as I mentioned. So we've got to get it right. We've got to learn how to do it. And Canada is a leader in this area. We've got a couple very large CCUS projects. And one thing we do well in Canada, we actually do policy quite well. We actually have, a suite through the Pan-Canadian framework on clean growth and climate change, a suite of policies. Some of the right price signals are there with low carbon fuel standards, with potentially, net zero power standards, ESG investing. So we actually do a lot of things well. We just need to do kind of more of them and get them organized.
Great, thanks, Janet. And of course, Sandra has some significant expertise in this subject. So Sandra, do you want to weigh in?
Yeah, thanks. Well, I would actually very much support what Janet said about, the various ways that CCS technology and know-how from Canada can be applied. And I was actually very happy to see it in the report as well. I think one of the things that we may need to do as we think about the role of CCS is, I know we call it CCUS, but carbon capture and geological sequestration is something at a much larger scale and frankly at a much further degree of development for actually reducing emissions, where carbon utilization is great and there's a lot of fantastic innovation going on. But when we talk about these things, sometimes we need to decouple them because, using carbon to produce carbon dioxide to augment make different products, consumer products, the scale at which and the difficulty in scaling that up to make a dent in emissions, I think is going to be quite different than what is literally already happening at a number of different locations in the world, including, as the group was talking about in Canada, with the least known pipeline in Canada, the Alberta Carbon Trunk Line, already capturing CO2, sequestering it, taking it down through a couple hundred kilometers through Alberta and using it in geological formations. A lot of people don't know how far ahead we are in the world on this front. And I think some of the resistance to it and the questioning about, is this a subsidy, is from a knee-jerk reaction to anything that looks like it's helping fossil fuel sector. And I think to the extent that we accept that fossil fuels are going to be with us for some time, regardless of which scenario, certainly if you look at forecasts, the use is going up. If you look at scenarios, there's still going to be fossil fuel used in the next 20, 30 years. So if you look at that, as well as all the other sectors in the economy that produce goods and services that we need and that have emissions of CO2, I think that carbon capture and storage is going to continue to be pursued, and whether we choose to do it in Canada or not, it will, somebody's going to be doing it in other parts of the world. They're certainly jumping all over it.
Yeah. I wonder if we know at some point we're going to be getting an oil and gas industry declining emissions cap. If we had a cap that was significantly stringent and the oil industry has significant capital available, if those two things might not work together well going forward.
Yeah, you can add in other heavy emitters too. You could add in cement and steel and other heavy emitters to that industry, and it would provide the demand pull needed to bring the CCUS and the DAC online.
Right. So that's the kind of policy alignment that we might look forward to. So I am going to now switch up and move into some of the specifics. And the first one, there's a few questions on, and I actually like the framing in one of them, which is sort of the whole idea of the bioeconomy. And so if you look at whether it's the protein and ag industry, whether it's wood, whether it's green chemicals made from bioeconomy, that those things seem to be lower in the priority list, whereas Canada as a country probably has one of the most significant bioeconomy opportunities. So just, I think the question is really, do you not see that, or why would you not think that some of those opportunities aren't a higher priority for us?
Well, I think we have two major opportunities, three really, that build on the bioeconomy in Canada. We have obviously the mass timber. It's about adding value, further downstream in the forestry. We talk about alternative proteins as something that's related specifically to crop agriculture. And
sorry, Jack. I think the question was they're all there, but are they less significant than carbon capture? Are they less significant than hydrogen? Are they less significant than heavy duty vehicles? Like it was more the ranking. I think it was a comment on the ranking, not on their absence.
Right. So yeah, and the green chemistry was the third one too, of course. The ranking, we didn't necessarily rank. The order we presented the thing is the seven. It's the top seven. We find it hard to ourselves to differentiate, to say one offers more priority than another. There are things that, CCUS and hydrogen that are in some ways more advanced, more understood. But in terms of potential for value add and jobs creation, we're not in a position to crunch numbers on that over the next 30 years. And there's so many uncertainties. But I think the fact that we actually have among those top seven, that we have those three that are very much directly related to the bioeconomy speaks to the potential that Canada has in these areas.
The tricky thing in those industries is that they're all really heavily dependent on the carbon accounting, and that is still really unstable. The science there is moving very quickly. And so we really do need to nail that stuff down as we deploy experiments in this. And this is another area, again, where, the kind of thing, like some kind of incentive to get agriculture to actually measure soil carbon in a massive national way would really be helpful to realizing whether or not the carbon storage potentials that we have there are going to be realizable or not. So we tended to rank those things. We definitely wanted to have a play in each of the major natural resource sectors in the Canadian economy for the exact reason that Derek outlined, but there's a lot of uncertainties about how those are going to be operationalized. So we looked specifically for where could we find a downstream market that would actually provide pull to sort out these difficult issues, right? Like let's sort out carbon accounting problems just for alternative proteins. And that will bring that particular piece of ag carbon accounting online. So we use these sectoral strategies as a way to do these structural cross-sectoral things that we know need to happen, like building out our electricity grid, figuring out behind the fence electricity all over the country so that we can build out manufacturing electricity outside of the grid. We need to do that everywhere across the country. Well, let's start doing it for automotive manufacturing. Let's just do the experiment for this one sector, and we'll figure out that bigger structural problem. Instead of, again, well, let's make a massive plan for power all over the country that we'll never finish and we'll never be able to finance. Like, let's just start doing these structural problems from the sectors with clear demand pulls. So again, we're not ranking them lower, but definitely those plays have a little more slipperiness to them, in part because we have to take a much more experimental and strategic approach in those places in order to bring them online. But they're absolutely essential to the Canadian economy, and we got to figure out these kind of plays that have a clear market pull in order to create alignment up and down the supply chain.
Great. Andy, did you want to make a quick comment?
Well, I just pick a couple of comments out of the chat earlier on where one or two commentators had put forward the notion that perhaps some of the ranking in our own little poll here came as a result of what do you read in the press and what's the general dialogue and how many times do people talk about a particular topic. And all that tells me is, my goodness, let's make sure that we're talking about this in a broad-based way, and it affects every industry. And the ag industry is a huge industry where we can capitalize and we can build real advantage. And if anything, arguably, who knows, but climate change may actually enhance our opportunity to be competitive over time in a sad way. But because of that, it strikes me that we've got this tremendous opportunity if we just focus on everything being required as being part of the solution, not just, adjust your energy source and you're done.
Great. Yeah, thanks so much, Andy. I'm going to feel a little bit like cross-country checkup here as we approach the end of the clock. I'm going to ask everyone to keep their comments concise. We're going to try to wrap up, but there's a couple of points here that I think are just really, really important. One is the question around the tech industry as its own industry. Clearly, it's going to be supporting a lot of these things, whether it's optimizing the electricity grid or buildings or even in the ag sector. Like, is there, and with the idea that Canada actually has a fairly sophisticated tech industry, where does that fit in your analysis?
Yeah, well, it's something we looked at to quite some detail. It didn't come up as it did actually come up as a specific area that, okay, we look at, companies such as Ecobee, for example, in small, segments, like, smart thermostats, some of Canada's startups in looking at clean and smart grid management. So we did look at that. And as we tried to emphasize, we don't think we have the last word on this. We were just looking for clusters, and the tech industry as a cluster was one that we ended up, not keeping just everything tech together because the applications are tied to some of these other areas. And we definitely see this sort of widespread digitalization across all of these sectors is an important enabler, along with things like the clean grid and the carbon accounting. Those are actually dependent on smart technologies. So it's just how we ended up configuring the sectors. So they're maybe not as it's not as visible, but it's there.
Great, thanks, Derek. Bentley, did you want to jump in
just
on
that
that
point? I would use it to make a broader point that I think has been kind of bubbling beneath the surface here, which is, I think Andy is right that we are actually really good in Canada at like TRLs 1 through 5, and then our abilities kind of slowly taper off to getting from 5 to 9, the commercial stage. And so it's that valley of death between we have a lab thing that works and we actually are commercial, where either Canadian firms get bought up or they fail because they can't secure the financing that they need. And what I would say is the clean tech industry generally suffers from something that is kind of structural to the Canadian economy, which is that we're not able to scale our own Canadian homegrown firms. We're dominated either by foreign-owned firms, or our best and most innovative companies are bought up. And this is a structural problem across all parts of the Canadian economy. And the net zero transition provides us with an opportunity to try to address some of those structural weaknesses. And scaling clean tech should be on that priority. And so developing a set of tools that actually translate from an innovation policy that's really focused on 1 to 5, what Dan Bresnitz calls novel innovation, to an innovation policy that talks about scaling and secondary innovation, which is where Dan Bresnitz wants us to put our energies and our chips, right? In other forms of innovation besides just the Silicon Valley model of creating novelty. It's that scaling that produces jobs, capital flows, spillovers into other industries, and that actually would create business expenditure on research and development, which is what we're really weak on. We spend just as much public money on R&D as any of our competitors in the OECD, but we're lagging behind on business investment. And that's because we don't scale our own companies here in Canada. And the Strategic Innovations Funds and the Net Zero Accelerator's approach to funding firms in this country exemplifies and reinforces this weakness, because it funds at the commercial stage and it funds a lot of foreign firms, right? So if we set up different avenues, different funding pathways that provide demonstration funds to help scale Canadian firms from 5 to 9, we're going to help these structural weaknesses. We're going to do the experimentation and the learning that we need to do. And we're going to get out of this risk averse only funding commercial, already profitable things, and really get ourselves into this area where we're experimenting, learning, failing in a productive, collective way.
And Bruce, I'll give a very concrete example about this on the battery supply chain side of things. A company in Nova Scotia called Novonix, basically the founder graduated from Jeff Dahn's lab. Jeff Dahn is known for his relationship with Tesla and being one of the leaders for the lithium-ion battery technology. So Chris graduates from his lab, great talent, starts a company, gets acquired by an Australian company, and then they're actually getting funding from the DOE in the US. They've set up a facility in Tennessee. They still have some operations in Nova Scotia, but now they're listed as on the NASDAQ, and they're getting acquired by Phillips 66. So this is a Canadian story of Canadian innovation and technology coming out of Nova Scotia from Halifax to becoming this world leader in terms of battery technology development that we completely missed out on because, you know, like I know that they've struggled to get support from the Canadian government because they're too small or they're not doing projects over $20 million, which is what the Strategic Innovation Fund is focused on right now. So I think, yeah, that's a very concrete example of these missed opportunities of really being able to scale up these companies that could potentially be, you know, these unicorn companies and homegrown companies that we have.
Great. Thanks, Mo. So we are winding down. I'm going to ask each of our panelists, but not you, Derek or Bentley, to give us our final comments in the order of Mo, then Janet, then Sandra, then Andy. So just final 30-second to 1 minute thoughts from each of you. Mo.
Yeah, so I think again on the zero emission vehicle supply chain side, you know, we have a very, very unique opportunity here. But the window of opportunity is closing. You know, we have existing world-leading firms along the supply chain, especially in the medium and heavy-duty space, where we can actually get a leg up there because that supply chain has not been fully established yet globally. But to really maximize that opportunity, we need to target those critical and high value added segments. And to do that, we need a comprehensive strategy that help us really identify what segments we should be focused on and create the alignment and the project pipeline that is going to be necessary to secure Canada's future in the global transportation sector. And I use transportation there because automotive is usually just thought of as light duty, but I think here we're thinking of a more comprehensive transportation sector. So I think that's really what we need to do next is that roadmap.
Great, thanks very much, Mo. Janet.
I would summarize, like, this is a great report, so please don't take my next comment. I mean, I just myself just published a policy paper, so, you know, this isn't meant to be a slighted by imagination, stretch of the imagination. But we really need to stop talking about the energy transition as an academic issue and create actual investment in projects that reduce carbon emissions. I want to say it's that simple. There are ways that we can reduce carbon emissions today. We don't have to wait for some kind of silver bullet technology to come, but we just need to get on with it. There is a sense of urgency. And, you know, given the realities of climate change, we're going to come up on another summer here. I hope I don't spend my summer engulfed in smoke from forest fires. I really don't think we can wait, and I think we're better off investing in creating the climate for investment in the things that we can do today.
Excellent, thank you, Sandra.
Yeah, thank you. I guess I would say my parting thoughts are number one, that the energy transition isn't just about the energy sector. It's about the way we all use energy and what we use it for. So that leads to number two, and that is that this work, as we know, affects every sector in the economy. And the piece that we also need to think about is consumer demand and consumer behavior and consumer/citizens acceptance of some of the transformations that are going to happen. I think that that is something that it's easier to focus on the big players and what are they doing about, you know, making sure we get to net zero. but as we learned looking at our portfolio, the carbon footprint of our residential mortgages portfolio for Scotiabank anyway is almost exactly the same size as that of our oil and gas portfolio. Obviously, it's because we do a lot more financing in residential mortgages. The point being that we are all implicated in this, and we have to make sure consumers and the social issues associated with the transition are also being contemplated in addition to the economic and environmental. So really a sustainability lens on all this work will be very valuable. And of course, I love the prioritization discussions that we've had about not spreading the peanut butter too thin. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Sandra. And Andy, last word.
Yeah, similar to Janet and similar to Sandra and Janet, let's not be doing this 3 years from now. Let's be talking about whether the choices we made and the actions we took can be enhanced or tweaked or moved or adjusted. So how do we turn we to I? We must to I'm going to. And how do we turn 3 years to 3 weeks? Like I'm going to in the next 3 weeks, the next 3 days. Here's what I'm going to do. And then similar to Sandra on the consumer side, but slight adjustment or slight different take, which would be, let's all contribute to building a narrative that the broad population can understand and get behind, because our polarized narrative right now is really acting against a constructive outcome.
Great, thank you very much, Andy. So thanks to all of you. Thanks, Bentley and Derek, for an outstanding paper, a great presentation. To all of our panelists, Janet, Mo, Sandra, and Andy, and not just for being on the line today, but you are all working incredibly hard in your day-to-day jobs, more than 40 hours a week, to make all of this a reality. So super pleasure for me. Thanks to the SPI gang for pulling all this together in a super organized way, Marian. So thanks to you, and it's been a pleasure. So let's all go off and think, what will we do in the next, hour, Andy, to make some big changes? Okay, thank you so much.